Hi biology students, Mr. Yager here today going through section 10.5 of human development out of our animal growth unit. Today what we're going to focus on, as you can see here with our learning objectives, is explaining the development of a fetus inside the mother. We're also going to describe fertilization in a human and the movement to the uterus. We're going to identify how a blastocyte protects the embryo. We are going to diagram a fetus as it gets nutrients from the mother and explain how the fetus gets nutrients from that mother. And we're also going to describe general development of the fetus. Alright, let's get started talking a little bit about the development of humans and most other mammals. And again, a mammal is considered an animal with hair and milk glands. Their embryos will develop within the mother, and the mother will provide warmth and a protected environment, and essentially that embryo is going to get its nutrients and its oxygen through the circulation process of the mother's blood, through the umbilical cord, which you can see right here, into the baby's blood. So we as human beings obviously need nutrition. We need all of our molecules of life to survive, proteins, carbohydrates, and the like. And we also need oxygen. So when you breathe in air, oxygen will go into your lungs, and that is considered your respiratory system, and that will work with your circulatory system to move that oxygen throughout to all of your cells and tissues. When you breathe air out, you breathe out something called carbon dioxide. So essentially what's happening is as the embryo is developing into a fetus, and that fetus develops into eventually a baby that comes out of the mother, it is going to need oxygen, and it is going to need to get rid of carbon dioxide. So the human egg is very small, about 0.1 millimeters in diameter, and contains almost no yolk. So when we think of yolk, we think of the yellow part of maybe a chicken egg, and a human egg essentially has no yolk. Once that egg is fertilized by a sperm, it is considered a zygote. And we discussed in section 10.3 that it goes through a process of cleavage, which is simultaneous cell division. And as it moves down the duct from the ovary into the uterus, it is going to go through this process of cleavage and develop cells. Mr. Hoffman discussed this in a little more detail in section 10.1. So about 5 days after fertilization, the embryo is considered a blastocyte, and it resembles the hollow blastula of other animals. So in section 10.3, we discussed the process of cell division, and as we move from one cell to two to four, and go through that exponential growth, we eventually get to something considered a blastula. So in this case, in humans, we can also call that a blastocyte. Now the blastocyte is going to sink into the wall of the mother's uterus and develop and grow, and that's exactly what Mr. Hoffman described to you in section 10.1. And we call that process implantation. And essentially the cells are going to grow into the mother's uterus. Once you are planted into the uterus, we start to develop that umbilical cord, eventually. And that is going to be how those cells get the nutrients and oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide that we discussed on the previous slide. So inside the blastocyte, we're going to have a thick mass of cells, as you can see in this picture right here. And that's going to form a disc. And that will essentially become the embryo. And remember, the embryo is eventually going to develop into a fetus, which will develop into a baby, but that part right there is going to develop into the embryo. In this disc, gastrulation occurs. And we discussed that in 10.3. Gastrulation is after the formation of a blastula or blastulocyte. And that is, again, a certain amount of mass of cells. In this disc, gastrulation occurs as it does in birds and reptiles. The rest of the blastocyte will develop into membranes that surround, nourish, and protect the embryo. So if you look here, if you look at my cursor, this whole area right here would be considered the rest of the blastocyte that is going to create a membrane to surround, nourish, and protect the embryo. So let's discuss a little bit more on that membrane. The first membrane, which you can see pointing to right in this area, is considered the amnion membrane. And maybe you've heard the term amniotic sac before. That's what this term is speaking to. And that's going to house something called the amniotic fluid, and that will surround the embryo. So essentially, if you look at this baby in here, it is an orange, or whatever color you want to consider that. That's all fluid. So the baby can actually float around in here a little bit, and that actually acts as a kind of a protective environment that we mentioned before. The chorion membrane encloses all other membranes and forms from the blastocyte's thin outer wall. So as you can see, that is going to be here in red. So you essentially have two membranes that will enclose around the embryo, and as the embryo develops into a fetus, which we see here, it's going to protect it. So as we go through the process of gastrulation, which again is developing more and more cells, growing and growing, the chorion extends finger-like projections, or villi, which you can see right here. And that's going to go in and project itself into the lining of the uterus. So I mentioned a couple slides before of how once we implant that mass of cells into the uterus, this process starts to form where we actually make a connection with the mother, because that embryo is going to need oxygen and nutrients and get rid of carbon dioxide. So the chorionic villi and the uterine lining form the placenta, which is a word I'm sure you've heard before, which will essentially exchange those nutrients, waste, oxygen, and carbon dioxide between the mother, which we consider the uterus over here, the portion of the mother, and the embryo. So blood vessels in the umbilical cord will connect to the embryo, to the placenta. So as you can see here, there is an umbilical cord right here, and that will connect from the embryo, or in this case we have a fetus, directly into the walls of the uterus. And that's how we're going to exchange all of those materials. All right, here you can see a picture of a human umbilical cord. Kind of gross, I imagine, if you haven't seen one before. But obviously right here, it's going to connect to your belly button. So if you look at your belly button now, at one point in time, there was an umbilical cord that connected there. That will fall off. You notice that they will actually clip that off once the baby is born. And usually sometimes the father will have the ability to clip that cord. Hopefully I'll have that ability here in the next couple weeks. And that will, once the baby is out into the world, it is not needed anymore. The baby hopefully has working lungs and a working heart and can then essentially move oxygen to its tissue. So they will clamp that off and they will cut it off, and eventually this tissue will fall off after a couple of days. You can notice some differences here. This umbilical cord, as you see, it's a little bit darker right now, and that's because there's actually blood in there. And you can kind of see that there's kind of two twists to it. Obviously, one can be blood coming in, one could be blood going out. Anytime there's oxygenated blood going into the embryo or the baby here, we consider that an artery. Arteries usually have oxygenated blood to send out to the tissues. And then when anything is coming back, we would consider that a vein, and that's going to be getting rid of wastes like carbon dioxide. So as I mentioned before, arteries carry waste and carbon dioxide from the embryo to the placenta. Veins return nutrients and oxygen. So you can see here in red, these would be considered arteries, and in blue, we would consider those veins. And essentially what that's speaking to is the presence of oxygen. So if there's oxygen there, you'll notice that the blood will be bright red. If there is not oxygen present, it usually has a darker color. We like to contrast that with blue, but in all reality, the blood is not blue if we look at it in real life, but it just kind of helps give you the idea that oxygenated blood will be red and deoxygenated blood will be blue. So the mother's blood will flow through the cavities, as you see here. These are all considered cavities, and then into the placenta. So it's almost like branches on a tree. So if we were talking about these red arteries right here, this would be bringing in oxygenated blood and nutrients, and that will travel all the way down, and all these branches will connect to kind of a main artery. And you notice we call that the umbilical artery, and that is what goes directly into your belly button. The chorionic villi is going to be responsible for extending into these cavities. So if we were to put a location for that chorionic villi, it would essentially be right in here. So as I said before, nutrients, waste will pass through the villi and embryonic blood vessels, but the two blood supplies remain constantly separate. So you can notice here that the umbilical arteries are coming in, and then we have the veins wrapped around, and that will be going back out. You can see in these kind of purple lines here. So that's going to go back into those cavities and essentially go back into the mother's bloodstream, and that will hopefully be a vein, because that vein in the mother would then take it back up to the lungs to get reoxygenated. Finally, we're going to discuss the whole process of this human development. Upon fertilization, and actually upon implantation, I believe Mr. Hoffman mentioned that in 10.1, it takes a human fetus about 40 weeks to develop in the uterus. That is considered full term. So I know we usually speak to the 9 months of pregnancy, but really they want to gauge that in weeks. So once implantation occurs into the uterus and we start developing that connection between the embryo and the mother, 40 weeks later, the baby's going to go through this process of development. And after the beginning of the 8th week, so about 2 months, the embryo is called a fetus. So after 8 weeks of development and cell growth and differentiation, the embryo is considered to be a fetus. After 3 months, or the first trimester, most of the organs have begun to form, and the skeleton can be seen in ultrasound images. And if you remember from 10.3, I discussed that all of these different organs and skeletons and heart and skin, they will develop out of those primary germ layers: the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. So most of the last 3 months or third trimester is a period of rapid growth and maturation of organ systems. And that's usually where we see an increased size in the baby. I know currently my wife is in her last trimester, and we have seen a massive increase in growth and maturation. And what you'll notice is that inside, right, and I guess you can see in this picture up top right, look at how much space that fetus has, all that amniotic fluid that it's sitting in. As it grows and develops, when we get closer to that last period, the baby will actually start to kind of run out of space. And that's when you notice some pretty crazy things. I know right now there's not a lot of space in my wife's tummy because that baby is growing and maturing. So essentially, anytime that baby moves, you can literally see that hand or that foot push through, not through the skin obviously, but through that skin. You can actually sometimes even identify fingers and toes, which is kind of creepy. But that baby is going through a rapid period of growth and maturation and getting bigger and bigger and bigger.